It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon at Mel's Diner in downtown Oakland, California. The lunch rush had ended, and only a few customers remained scattered across the red vinyl booths. At a corner table near the window sat Robert Miller, a 73-year-old man with silver hair and gentle eyes, quietly eating his soup and reading the newspaper. He wore a simple plaid shirt and worn jeans, looking like any other retired grandfather enjoying a peaceful lunch. Most people wouldn't give Robert a second glance. He was soft-spoken, polite to the waitress, and left generous tips. He'd been coming to Mel's Diner twice a week for the past 5 years, always ordering the same thing: chicken noodle soup and coffee, black. The staff knew him as a kind old man who lived alone and seemed to have nowhere urgent to be, but nobody at Mel's Diner knew Robert's story. They didn't know that 52 years ago, he had been a 22-year-old Army medic serving in Vietnam. They didn't know that he had saved the lives of 12 Vietnamese children during a devastating rocket attack, or that he had been awarded a Purple Heart and Bronze Star for his service. Most importantly, they didn't know about the day in 1971 when he returned home to San Francisco International Airport and was greeted not with gratitude, but with hatred. As Robert quietly turned the pages of his newspaper, 3 college students entered the diner. They were young, passionate, and wearing T-shirts with various political messages. They took a booth across from Robert, their conversation loud enough to carry across the small restaurant. "I'm telling you, the military-industrial complex is still destroying lives," said Jake, a 20-year-old with long hair and intense eyes. "These old war criminals are still walking around free, pretending they're heroes." His friend Sarah nodded vigorously. "My professor was just talking about Vietnam War atrocities. All those soldiers were basically baby killers. They went over there and murdered innocent civilians." The third student, Marcus, pulled out his phone and started showing his friends photos from a documentary he'd watched. "Look at this. Napalm victims, destroyed villages. Every single soldier who participated in that war has blood on their hands." Robert's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. The familiar knot formed in his stomach, the same feeling he'd carried for over 50 years. He tried to focus on his newspaper, but the students' voices grew louder. "The worst part is they came back and expected to be treated like heroes," Jake continued, his voice dripping with disgust. "My grandfather always said the Vietnam vets were baby killers, and he was right. They don't deserve respect. They deserve to be held accountable." Robert's hands began to tremble slightly. He thought about little Lynn, the 6-year-old Vietnamese girl he'd pulled from the rubble of her family's home. He remembered carrying her to the medical helicopter, her tiny hand gripping his finger as he whispered reassuring words in broken Vietnamese. "They're all the same," Sarah added, gesturing around the diner. "Look around. I bet half these old guys were over there killing babies. They should be ashamed to show their faces in public." The elderly man at the corner table was obviously eavesdropping now, and Jake noticed. "Hey, old man," he called out loudly. "You ever serve in Vietnam?" Robert looked up from his newspaper, his heart pounding. The entire diner had gone quiet. Even the waitress stopped wiping down tables to listen. "Yes," Robert said quietly. "I did." "I knew it." Jake slammed his hand on the table, causing other diners to turn and stare. "Another baby killer. How many innocent children did you murder over there?" Robert set down his spoon with shaking hands. "I never killed any children." Marcus laughed harshly. "Right. They all say that. Every war criminal claims they were just following orders, or that they never hurt anyone innocent." "You people make me sick," Sarah added, her voice rising. "You went to a foreign country, destroyed families, killed babies, and then came home expecting parades." Well, we see through your lies. The diner was completely silent now. Other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. An elderly woman at a nearby table looked distressed, and a middle-aged man appeared ready to intervene. Robert stood up slowly, his legs unsteady after decades of carrying both physical and emotional wounds. He was a small man, made smaller by age, and the weight of years spent believing he was what these young people said he was. "You're right about one thing," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was in Vietnam. I was there for 18 months. See?" Jake pointed triumphantly. "He admits it. Baby killer." "I was a medic," Robert continued, his voice growing slightly stronger. "My job was to save lives, not take them." "Bullshit," Marcus spat. "You were all murderers. Every single one of you." Robert reached into his wallet with trembling fingers and pulled out a worn photograph. He walked slowly to the students' table and placed it in front of them. The photo showed a young man in army fatigues kneeling beside a hospital bed, holding the hand of a small Vietnamese girl. Other children were visible in the background, all being treated for injuries. "That's me in 1970, Robert said quietly. "And that's Lynn. She was 6 years old when a rocket destroyed her village. I pulled her from the rubble and carried her to safety." The students looked at the photo, their expressions shifting from anger to confusion. Robert pulled out another photo. "This is the village of Phu Bai after a mortar attack. I spent 3 days there treating wounded children, working around the clock to save as many as I could." Jake picked up the photo, studying it closely. The image showed a young medic surrounded by Vietnamese children, some bandaged, others smiling despite their injuries. "These are propaganda photos," Sarah said weakly, but her voice lacked conviction. Robert reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wooden cross. "This was given to me by a Vietnamese grandfather whose grandson I saved. He carved it himself and pressed it into my hands before I left." He placed the cross on the table next to the photos. "I delivered 12 babies during my tour," Robert continued, his voice growing stronger. "I treated countless children for malaria, dysentery, and wounds from combat. I never harmed a child in my life." The elderly waitress, Dolores, who had been serving Robert for 5 years, approached the table. "You never told us you were a war hero, honey." "I'm not a hero," Robert said, shaking his head. "I was just doing my job." Marcus looked up from the photographs, his face pale. "If this is true, then why?" "Why what?" Robert asked. "Why didn't anyone know? Why do people say?" Robert sat down heavily in an empty chair. "Because when I came home in 1971, I was met at San Francisco Airport by protesters just like you. They spit on me, called me a baby killer, threw things at me. For 52 years, I've carried the shame of what they said I was." The diner remained silent, except for the soft hum of the coffee machine. "I've spent my entire adult life wondering if maybe they were right," Robert continued. "Maybe I was a monster. Maybe saving those children wasn't enough to make up for being part of that war." Jake stared at the photos, his hands shaking. I didn't know. I thought all soldiers." "You thought wrong," said a voice from across the diner. An elderly black man stood up from his booth. "I served with medics like Robert. They saved my life in Da Nang." He walked over to their table. "This man is a hero, and you kids just treated him like garbage." Another voice joined in. A middle-aged woman stood up. "My father was a Vietnam veteran. He never talked about the war, but he wasn't a baby killer. He was 19 years old and scared." More customers began standing up, approaching Robert's table. Stories began pouring out. A grandson of a Vietnam veteran, a daughter of a nurse who served in the war, a man whose uncle had been a helicopter pilot who rescued wounded soldiers. Jake looked at Robert, tears in his eyes. "Sir, I am so sorry. I had no idea. I just believed what I heard, what I read." "I know," Robert said gently. "I understand your anger about the war. I understand your feelings about what happened over there. But I need you to understand something, too." He picked up the photograph of himself with the Vietnamese children. This war destroyed a lot of lives. Vietnamese lives. American lives. But not everyone who served was a killer. Some of us were trying to heal the damage, trying to help people survive something terrible. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. "How do you not hate us? We just called you horrible names, accused you of terrible things." Robert smiled sadly. "Because you're the same age I was when I went to Vietnam. You're passionate about justice. You care about innocent people being hurt. Those are good qualities. You just directed them at the wrong target." Marcus looked at the wooden cross, then at Robert. "What happened to the girl? Lynn?" "I don't know," Robert admitted. "I've wondered about her for 52 years. I hope she grew up, got married, had children of her own. I hope she lived a good life." Dolores, the waitress, wiped her eyes with her apron. "Robert, honey, why didn't you ever tell us? We've known you for years." "Because I learned a long time ago that people don't want to hear the truth about Vietnam," Robert said. "They want simple stories about heroes and villains. The reality is more complicated." Jake stood up abruptly. "I need to do something. This is wrong. You shouldn't have to carry this shame." "What do you mean?" Robert asked. "I mean, people need to know the truth. They need to know about medics like you, about the real stories from Vietnam." Over the next several weeks, Jake, Sarah, and Marcus threw themselves into research. They interviewed Vietnam veterans, read first-hand accounts from medics and nurses, and learned about the complexity of a war they had only understood through political slogans. They organized a community event at their college, inviting Vietnam veterans to share their stories. Robert was reluctant at first, but eventually agreed to participate. The night of the event, the college auditorium was packed. Students, faculty, and community members filled every seat. Robert sat on stage with 5 other Vietnam veterans, including the black man from the diner, whose name was James Washington. When it was Robert's turn to speak, he pulled out the same photographs he had shown the students in the diner. "52 years ago, I came home from Vietnam and was called a baby killer," he began. "For 5 decades, I believed that might be true. Not because I had killed children, but because good people told me I was a monster, and I started to believe them." The auditorium was completely silent. "But I want to show you what I actually did in Vietnam." He told the story of Lynn, of the village of Phu Bai, of the 12 babies he delivered, and the countless children he treated. He showed the photographs, passed around the wooden cross, and shared letters he had received from Vietnamese families after the war. When he finished, the auditorium erupted in applause. People stood, cheered, and many were crying openly. After the event, Jake approached Robert with his phone in hand. "Sir, I've been looking for someone, and I think I found her." On the phone screen was a Facebook page for Dr. Lynn Nguyen, a pediatric surgeon in San Jose, California. The profile photo showed a woman in her late 50s wearing medical scrubs. "I contacted her and told her about you," Jake said excitedly. "She wants to meet you. She remembers an American soldier who saved her life when she was little." The reunion took place at UCSF Medical Center, where Dr. Nguyen worked. When Robert walked into her office, she immediately stood up and bowed in the traditional Vietnamese manner. "Sergeant Miller," she said in perfect English, I have been looking for you my entire life." Robert stared at her, seeing the same kind eyes he remembered from the 6-year-old girl in the hospital photograph. "You saved my life," she continued, "and because of you, I became a doctor. I've spent my career saving children, just like you saved me." Robert began to cry, 52 years of pain and shame finally beginning to heal. Dr. Nguyen showed him around the pediatric ward, where she treated children from all over the world. "Every child I save is because of what you taught me," she said, "that even in the darkest times, there are people who choose to heal instead of harm." The story of Robert Miller and Dr. Lin Nguyen was featured in newspapers across the country. The college students who had called him a baby killer became advocates for Vietnam veterans, working to change the narrative about their service. On his 74th birthday, Robert received a letter from the Vietnamese American community in San Jose. They were establishing a scholarship fund for medical students, named in honor of Sergeant Robert Miller, the American medic who proved that healing is stronger than hatred. At the scholarship ceremony, Robert stood before an audience of Vietnamese Americans, many of whom had been children during the war. One by one, they approached him to thank him for his service, not as a soldier, but as a healer. "For 52 years, I believed I was what people said I was," Robert told the audience. "I let other people's anger become my shame. But I learned something important. The truth doesn't change just because people refuse to see it." He looked out at the faces before him, young and old, Vietnamese and American, all united in recognition of a simple truth. "I was never a baby killer. I was a baby saver. And so were thousands of other young Americans who went to Vietnam not to destroy, but to heal, to help, and to serve." The standing ovation lasted 10 minutes. After the ceremony, as Robert prepared to leave, Dr. Nguyen approached him one final time. "Sergeant Miller," she said, "I have something for you." She handed him a small carved wooden cross, identical to the one he had carried for 52 years. "My grandfather made this before he died," she explained. "He told me to give it to the American soldier who saved his great-granddaughter's life. He said you would understand what it means." Robert held the cross in his weathered hands, feeling the weight of 5 decades of misunderstanding finally lifting from his shoulders. "Thank you," he whispered. "No," Dr. Nguyen replied. "Thank you for saving my life, for becoming the man you are, and for showing the world that even in war, there are those who choose love over hate." Robert Miller's story became a powerful reminder that assumptions can destroy lives, but truth can restore them. The elderly man who had been called a baby killer in a small diner had spent his life proving that character is defined not by the labels others place on us, but by the choices we make and the lives we touch. In the end, his legacy wasn't just his service in Vietnam or his work as a medic. It was his demonstration that healing is possible, that understanding can triumph over hatred, and that sometimes it takes 50 years for the truth to be heard. But when it is, it has the power to change hearts and minds. Never judge someone's service by the politics of their war. Never assume you know someone's story based on their age or appearance. And remember that the person you're calling a killer might actually be a healer, carrying wounds that your words have the power to deepen or help heal. Because sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on foreign soil, but in the hearts and minds of people learning to see beyond stereotypes to the truth of who we really are.